Hey, APUSH kiddos. It is Thursday, and I am getting ready to record your lesson for Friday, November 13th. Ugh, another Friday the 13th. That's all we need. I think the last time I wrote Friday the 13th was on March 13th on the board, and that was our last day of school before the pandemic. So, hopefully this Friday will not be that eventful. So hope you guys are doing well. I am going to walk you through the next few pages of chapter 7. And I'm going to try to just kind of plow through this material, keep it simple, hopefully you guys are reading and staying on top of things. If we were in class, we would be doing some fun exercises, but we're not in class. So we have a lot of ground to cover before the AP exam. I am behind schedule, so I need to pick up the pace a bit. So my plan is to cover pages, hold that thought. I can't remember what pages I'm covering today. 254 through about 265, 266, basically the stuff on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Federalist Papers. The last 4 or 5 pages of your chapter deal with, now that this Constitution has been established, what does that mean for the Native American and what does that mean for the slave? Is this liberty, this new democratic sphere going to apply to them? And so today I'm going to kind of cover everything before that, and then on Monday I will have a lesson for you specifically related to that. So before I continue, if you have not already written or gone and done the writing prompt, you need to hit pause and go do that first. The Google Doc for today's writing prompt is only open until 9:45. Actually, it stays open, but if you submit it after 9:45, it is considered late. And so make sure that you try to get that done before 9:45 and then jump back into the video lecture. So let's see here. All right, so quick review. The American War for Independence has concluded. The Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1783, brought a temporary peace between us and the British, although it will raise its ugly head again, coming up fairly soon in the War of 1812. With the Treaty of Paris, America acquired a lot of new land, and thus we saw a lot of people moving west into territories that they could not farm before, they couldn't live in. The Articles of Confederation was America's first written constitution. It was created by members of the Confederation Congress, is what they would be. They were called Continental Congress during the War for Independence or the American Revolution, but then they took on the name the Confederation Congress because the first constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. And so it governed the states through the American Revolution, and then just a little bit beyond. There were lots of troubles associated with the Articles of Confederation, and so you began to see everyday, average, ordinary people who were suffering under the weight of debt, the fear of debtor courts, the inability to provide for their families became very cantankerous. Rebellions kind of popped up mostly in rural areas where farming was predominant, and things got kind of ugly. So the Articles of Confederation were inept in dealing with these crises of the common man. There was no federal judiciary. There was no way for Congress to enforce the laws that it enacted. It couldn't collect taxes. And so I think I read somewhere that the Confederation Congress didn't even meet most of the time because they never had a quorum of people, of representatives there to conduct business. So that is sort of how the states considered the Confederation Congress, kind of secondary to everything else. But as the winds blew and trouble brewed and things like Shays' Rebellion happened, there was much alarm, especially amongst property-owning Americans who were really afraid that this experiment in democracy, this new country that they had fought for, was going to fall apart. And so very important people like Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Knox, James Madison, others screamed the alarm, began to meet for various reasons, probably the most often, the cause they most often met for was to figure out interstate and international trade policies and tariff policies and money policies, because the states were hindered from growing economically because they had a hard time trading amongst one another. And it became very confusing and lots of red tape. And so that was kind of probably the thing that initially sparked these gatherings. But then Shays' Rebellion was the catalyst that finally was like, all right, we have 1,000 crazy farmers in Western Massachusetts that are shutting down the courts. We have lawlessness is abounding in our country. We need to do something about it. And so at the invitation of Alexander Hamilton, delegates from 12 of the 13 states met at the Pennsylvania State House in the same place where they had argued independence, and they pounded out a new constitution. I told the other class, can you imagine if Barack Obama, we'll use Barack Obama as an example, if Barack Obama one day came on television and announced to the country, hey everybody, we decided that the Constitution was pretty ineffectual, and so we have decided to write a new Constitution, and we'll be sending copies to the newspaper so you can take a look at our new Constitution. People would freak out. They would just talk about the overreach of power. You can't do that. That's our Constitution. And so there was a concern that that's how Americans would respond or react when they heard that their Confederation Congress, or this convention of property-owning people, was going to shred the Articles of Confederation. And so they promised a vow of secrecy amongst the delegates there. I do believe that Benjamin Franklin was assigned sort of like bodyguards that traveled with him to and from his house and anywhere he would go to in the city of Philadelphia, because they were concerned that he would spill the beans. Benjamin Franklin loved to talk and tell stories, and so there was a concern that he might let it slip that what they were doing. And so he was assigned a couple of people to be with him to, redirect conversations that might come up. But they managed somehow to keep it a secret for almost 4 months. They closed the window blinds, they locked the doors, they didn't allow reporters into the room, and they pounded out this new Constitution. It was not perfect. It required a number of compromises to see it across the finish line, but it certainly was more effective than the Articles of Confederation. Again, in just a real quick review, some of the compromises associated with the Constitutional Convention. The Great Compromise, or sometimes referred to as the Connecticut Compromise, written by Roger Sherman, was probably the most significant compromise as far as getting it across the finish line. And that was the plan to take James Madison's Virginia plan of a bicameral legislature based upon population, to take that model and just tweak it a little bit so that the House of Representatives would be based on population, so the large states were satisfied. And then the Senate, the more deliberative body where senators serve for 6 years, would be an equal representation for small as well as large states, with every state having 2 representatives or 2 senators that serve for 6 years. The second big leap they had to make was what to do about slavery. If the House of Representatives was going to be based on population, then slave owners wanted to count their slaves because they would get more representatives in Congress. And they debated about it. And so my understanding is that abolitionist-leaning congressmen or delegates from the North decided to propose the idea of only allowing slave owners to count 3 out of every 5 slaves rather than a total 1 for 1. And so while on the surface it sounds terrible, the 3/5 compromise, suggesting that people are only worth 3/5 a person, it actually significantly reduced the number of representatives that would be based upon the slave population. It's still terrible, but better than it could have been. They decided to keep their hands off the African slave trade for 20 years. Congress, however, did outlaw the slave trade on the 20th anniversary of the U.S. Constitution. The Electoral College would elect the president, who would serve for a 4-year term. Delegates would be chosen from state legislatures, or state legislatures would choose electorates who would cast the vote for president based upon, at least loosely, how the people had voted. At the time, I think every state allowed electorates to go the same route as the public or not. Today, some states actually require their delegates or their electorates to vote along the popular vote tally, and then others give them freedom to vote against it. And that happens every now and then, but not en masse. It's never affected the outcome of a presidential election where the will of the people was this, and the electorates decided to go this way. That's never happened. You've had one or two go rogue, but as a package, it's never happened. So the only branch of our federal government that is directly elected by the people at the time of the Constitution was the House of Representatives. Senators were chosen from their state legislatures, and then the president was chosen by the Electoral College, and then federal judges were appointed by the president with the approval of the Senate, part of that checks and balances. And then once another big hurdle they had to overcome was, if we decide to change this Constitution, 10 years from now, are we just going to tear it up like we did the Articles of Confederation? Or are we going to weave within the Constitution the ability to change it or to amend it? And of course, they went with the amendment process. They made it very difficult to amend the Constitution, but it's doable. So traditionally, the way the Constitution has been amended, there's 27 amendments. The first 10, the Bill of Rights, were introduced together, passed together. But the process of amending the Constitution is that 2/3 of both the House and the Senate have to propose an amendment to the Constitution and vote, yes, we want to introduce this or propose it. And if both the House and Senate agree in a 2/3 vote or more, then that amendment goes out to the states, and they can either call special state conventions or they can use their state legislatures. And 3/4 of all of the states have to vote yes for the new amendment in order for the Constitution to be changed. Excuse me. And so it's very difficult to amend the Constitution, but it can be done, and it prevents a group of property-owning white guys, as happened at the Constitutional Convention, to just tear it up and start over again. And just so that you know, that was tongue-in-cheek as far as the white guys. I'm being politically incorrect. I'm being silly. So I don't want anybody screaming at me about that. Okay, so let me jump back up here. Okay, so most of you all are familiar with the preamble to the United States Constitution. So the preamble to the U.S. Constitution is sort of like the Declaration of Independence in that it was a statement of why. So the Declaration of Independence was a statement or a case for why independence. The preamble to the U.S. Constitution is a statement of why we need a new Constitution. And so it's on the PowerPoint. I want you to read it or read along with me. But if you would, in the back of your mind as you're reading it, think about the problems associated with the Articles of Confederation, the problems that happened in our country as a result of the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Think about Shays' Rebellion. So it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, and to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity," which is our children and our grandchildren, "do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So you could almost put, number one, are we the people of the United States? Number one, in order to form a more perfect union. Number two, in order to establish justice. Number three, to ensure domestic tranquility. Number four, to provide for the common defense. Number five, to promote the general welfare. Number six, to secure the blessings of liberty, And so those were the 6 things that this new Constitution was going to do that the Articles of Confederation had just done a disaster of. I mean, you can go through that list. To ensure domestic tranquility, well, there was no tranquility in the years after the Revolution under the Articles of Confederation. The economy was collapsing, Farmers were, marching through the streets, shutting down debtor courts. Things were very, very tense. What was the other one? To provide for the common defense. Congress couldn't even raise an army to go rescue the government of Massachusetts from these crazy farmers. And so it was a why we needed a new constitution. Let's see here. This new constitution, again, is provided for separation of powers, or sometimes called checks and balances. I think of them as different things, but not everybody does. The Article 1 was the legislative branch, which is Congress, and Congress's primary responsibility is to make laws. The second article of the Constitution covers off on the responsibilities of the executive branch. So that's the president and all of the people underneath him. And the executive branch enforces the laws passed by Congress. So if Congress passes a law, the president's department is supposed to make sure those laws are followed. And then the third article of the Constitution is the judicial branch. So it's a federal judiciary that is going to deal with federal things, in large part international trade, interstate commerce. I think that the Supreme Court or the federal courts, the thing they most often deal with are things related to trade and money. And then the judicial branch interprets laws. So again, the legislative branch makes laws, the executive branch enforces those laws, and then the judicial branch interprets the laws that Congress has passed and applies that to such circumstances that come before them. So that's the way the Constitution was written. I didn't say this before, but there are 7 articles to the U.S. Constitution. The first 3 are the ones we talk the most about, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, but the other articles are important, obviously, as well. Article 4 deals with the federal control of interstate and international trade against money, commerce. Article 5 describes the amendment process. Article 6 is a statement of the supremacy of the federal Constitution. Essentially, it basically said that when states ratified the Constitution, they were agreeing that the final law of the land, or the umbrella over all of the constitutions, state constitutions, would be the United States Constitution, the federal Constitution. It's called the Supremacy Clause. And then the final article, Article 7, spells out how to ratify this Constitution. It's only a couple sentences, and it basically says, if 9 of the 13 states will ratify this Constitution in state legislatures or state conventions, then it becomes a law of the land. So it only required 9 instead of the 13 that the Articles of Confederation required. And so it went out to the state legislatures where it got into a bit of a tiff, the passage of the Constitution did, with people called anti-federalists. People who were in favor of the Constitution were called Federalists, in favor of a federal power, federal government. And those who were against it were called anti-federalists. And there were some pretty powerful people that were anti-federalists. Patrick Henry of Virginia comes to mind. The book mentioned John Hancock, who was from the New England states. There was somebody else. I think Sam Adams was also opposed to a federal constitution. And of course, John Hancock and Sam Adams had been instrumental in throwing off England. So the last thing they wanted to do was to bring on a new king or president. And so I suppose if John Adams had been present, I'm not sure how he would have felt. He was overseas at the time. He wasn't in Massachusetts to experience the troubling nature of the lawlessness of these uprisings. He was about law and order, so maybe he would have gone with the Constitution. I don't know. Thomas Jefferson ultimately favored the Constitution, although he was a little sketchy on it. He was overseas as well. But apparently James Madison, his good buddy, who for all intents and purposes pretty much wrote the Constitution, or at least the outline of it, sent a copy of the final Constitution to Jefferson to get his thoughts and to get his approval. And Jefferson basically said, well, it's not perfect, but it'll do. And so, and of course, James Madison was a huge advocate of the Constitution that he pretty much wrote. So you have this power grab, this fight that ensues between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. In Hamilton, the musical Hamilton, there is a, let me see if I can find it really quick here. There's a song. called Nonstop Hamilton, and it's pretty much a rap song. I'm going to include it in a link, and I'd like for you to at least watch or listen to it. If you have Disney Plus, you can, I suppose, go watch it. It blends into a song with Angelica too, but the first 3 or 4 minutes of the song is really about Hamilton's involvement in the Federalist Papers and Aaron Burr's role in defending the Constitution and all of that. New York continued to be a problematic state, and the founding or the authors or the Federalists who supported the Constitution really wanted New York with them, and Virginia and some of those states, those more powerful states. And so I'd like for you to listen to that rap, that song. If you, I don't think I'm probably not gonna do this, but if you pull up if you can't understand it or watch it in subtitles, it's really interesting how it corresponds with what we're talking about today. So it goes out to the states where the state conventions and the state legislatures are, I think they were all state conventions, debated whether or not to adopt this Constitution. There are, on the PowerPoint, I have 2 different positions of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. I'm not going to read them in the video because you can read them yourselves, but read through those positions. Those are just examples of people's position. One of them was written by Alexander Hamilton. The other one was written by Melancton Smith, who I have no idea who that is. All right. Also, I want you guys to read the Federalist number 51, I believe I've got here. Yeah, it's on page 122. So hopefully you have these at home. If you don't have this at home, if you would let me know, I'll scan it and send you a copy of it, and I'll upload it to Google Classroom. But I want you to read Federalist number 51, which was written by James Madison. I believe Alexander Hamilton wrote 50 of the Federalist Papers. James Madison wrote 30, I think, and then John Jay wrote the additional 5. And so the Federalist Papers, again, as you know, were a group of 85 essays that were published in very powerful Federalist-controlled newspapers, primarily in New York, to coerce, encourage the state legislatures or the state conventions that were considering ratification to ratify this new Constitution. The Federalist Papers are said to be the most eloquent, proficient, or magnanimous descriptions and explanations of our form of government ever written. So if you were to go to law school and focus on constitutional law, you would consume the Federalist Papers. You would read them, you would study them, you would evaluate them. I personally find that I understand them better when I read somebody else's evaluation of them, because some of them are really, really hard to understand. But you have to know what they are. You need to be able to have a general understanding of what the purpose was of the Federalist Papers. And in light of our current situation with the election craziness and the looting and the lawlessness that took place over the summer, I think you'll be able to relate to Federalist number 51 and James Madison's concern of lawlessness and uprisings of people who don't have the best interest of the public at large. And so anyway, of course, James Madison makes the argument that republicanism or democracy can be more successful in a large country where you have divested interests and lots of different minority groups than it would be in a small setting where emotions and it can rage. And so anyway, you probably already read that in your reading, but I do want you to read Federalist number 51. I don't really care when you read it. You can stop the video now and go read it, but I am going to ask you in your daily assignment log if you read it. So I think that you'll find it very interesting. Okay, so the Federalist, the U.S. Constitution is finally ratified. There's a very important political cartoon that you'll see in the PowerPoint. This one has shown up in AP tests and AP quizzes. It's probably one of the most recognizable political cartoons of this era, and so you need to be familiar with it. It's basically a image of all columns that represent all 13 of the states that were considering ratifying this new constitution. North Carolina and Rhode Island are falling over at the end there, or maybe you could say they're getting pushed up. This is the foundations are good. It may yet be saved. Yes, it will. And North Carolina and Rhode Island were the last two states to ratify the Constitution, and I believe both of those states ratified the Constitution after it had already become the law of the land and after George Washington was already president. Remember, it only took 9 of the 13 states to ratify it, so eventually they do ratify it, and it becomes the law of the land. So just super quick, I want to talk about 5 things. And the PowerPoint says the Constitution establishes this. And so these 5 principles, sometimes referred to as 6 separate principles, are woven into the Constitution, and they're an intricate part of the Constitution, yet they are never necessarily specifically spelled out in the Constitution. But the principles are there by the way that it's written, by the powers that are assigned, etc. So the first one is checks and balances and separation of powers. So we've already talked a little bit about this, the idea that Madison and others who wrote the Constitution wanted to disperse power amongst the branches of government, to give everybody their own kind of responsibility so that there's not a centralized power. And I personally would say that the founders gave more power to the Congress than it did to other branches of government, but that's simply just based upon the length of that portion of the Constitution. For instance, the Article 1 of the 7 articles is 2 of the 4 pages of the U.S. Constitution. It takes up 2 pages. Article 2, which spells out the responsibilities of the executive branch, is about 3/4 of a page. And then Article 3, which is the federal judiciary, is really only about the size of a large paragraph. It essentially says there will be a federal judiciary and Congress is going to write some laws to create it. There will be a Supreme Court. And so just based upon the time given or the space allotted to each of these articles, those writing the Constitution, for future members and previous members of the Congress, gave themselves a lot of space in the Constitution. But nonetheless, each branch of government has its own tools that it can use to prohibit abuse of power. So the intent of the founders was to slow down the wheels of governing so that rash decisions would not be made. So, for instance, all of the clunkiness that's going to enter into the next president's term, whether that be Donald Trump or Joe Biden, there's such a great amount of differing opinions that someone like AOC is not going to be like, okay, the Green New Deal is the law of the land. We're going to shut down fracking and oil, and everybody needs to reduce the amount of electricity they use. And oh, by the way, you can't have brunch because brunch consumes too much food, and we do not want to send gases into the air that are going to destroy our universe. Whatever. Those kind of crazy things. While she can spout them all she wants, the wheels of our government are not going to allow that sort of nonsense to get through. And so while we get frustrated by the slowness of the way that our government functions, it's actually a blessing because it prevents a lot of crazy. And sometimes the prevention of crazy happens because we're fighting for another election, the new election cycle. So that's the way it's meant to be. Federalism, is the division of power between the state government and the federal government. The federal government has its thing. The state governments have their things, and they hopefully work well together. They each have their own responsibilities. The state has things going on that the federal government doesn't want to deal with, and the federal government has stuff going on that the states don't want to deal with. For instance, can you imagine if the state governments were tasked with coming up with a vaccine for coronavirus? We don't have the resources. Our governor doesn't have the time or the resources to focus on that. So it's good that the federal government is focusing on that. The state government will help by distributing it, but the federal government is kind of the mastermind behind it. Okay, the third one is the principle of limited government. This is probably one of the most important parts of our Constitution. Our government's power is limited to only those powers that it is given in the United States Constitution. So our government's power is limited by our government, if that makes sense. Our founding fathers, the early leaders of our country, feared large, strong, centralized, powerful government because of monarchy and the divine right of kings and the history of monarchical abuse and those sorts of things. And so they were very intentional about saying, yes, we need a federal government, but its powers will be limited to this, and this. And for instance, in Article 1 of the Constitution, there are, I think it's 17 specific listed powers of Congress. Sometimes they're referred to as enumerated powers, which means they are spelled out. Congress has the power to tax. Congress has the power to declare war. Congress has the power to run a postal service. Congress has the power to issue patents. Congress has the power to and there are 17 of them, I believe. And so our Congress is limited to those powers that the Constitution gives them. The same is true with our president. The president does not have just, forever or an unlimited power. He is limited to certain things. He does not have the power to write a law, although he can issue executive orders that are temporary. He does not have the power to issue a mask mandate across the country. It would be considered a violation of states' rights. He may try, but he doesn't have the authority. Who will determine that? The courts will. The courts do not have the authority to pass laws. They interpret laws. And so if a court becomes an activist court and begins to make rulings that create laws that don't exist, they are outside of their bounds. They don't have limitless power. They are limited in their power. So that's very, very important. I would say most people don't understand that. Most people today do not understand that we have limited government. They believe government is the end-all, save-all, problem solver for everything going on in our individual lives. And that was not the intention of the founding fathers that wrote the Constitution. Judicial review. This is a really important one, and we will talk about this more. But judicial review is the principle that the courts, federal or state courts, have the authority to determine whether or not laws passed by Congress are constitutional or not. So it goes back to the idea of them interpreting laws. That's their job. So if a case comes to them and the person claims, my rights have been violated, the court will look and see, well, which law was violated? And they will look at the laws that said person says have been violated, and they will determine whether or not that law that's being applied to the situation is a constitutional law. So that's the practice of judicial review. Judges reviewing cases and laws to determine if it's founded on true constitutional principles, etc. And then the last one is popular sovereignty, and that's an old-fashioned way of saying people are the source of their government's power. Goes back to the social compact or social contract that exists between us and those whom serve us. They are there at our request, our pleasure, because we voted for them, and the majority of people have chosen them. And so we are the source of their power because we voted for them. And so that's popular sovereignty. That is a huge part of our system. That's why it's super important that this election is correct and lawful, and that there has not been fraud that has been imparted upon the system, because we are the source of our government's power. And if there were outside sources that injected themselves into our election by, for instance, introducing absentee ballots that were sent out to dead people, for example, or if a outside company system that tabulates votes intentionally miscounted certain votes for one candidate over the other. That means that the will of the people is being thwarted and that we are no longer sovereign over our own leaders and the choices of those that we elect. And so that's really super important that we get that right in this particular election. And so those are the 5 or 6 principles that are established within the Constitution based upon its framework. Okay, I think with that said and done, I think I'm going to kind of pause there, and then we'll finish chapter 7 on Monday. So those are the nuts and bolts. I could spend a semester talking about the Constitution, but we have to kind of press on. I'll recircle back around to some of this, but read the instructions in Google Doc. I'm just trying to get this video recorded so I can upload it, because it takes 2 or 3 hours to upload it to YouTube. So I'm doing this the day before. So read the instructions. I do want you to watch or listen to the song by Hamilton. I do want you to read the Federalist number 51. And then over the weekend, I want you to answer some of your period 3 questions and have them ready for Wednesday, I believe is what I said. So I'll have that instruction in the instructions as well. Bye.